Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second BTS Spark summer series. I hope you're all doing well. For those who were not present in our first initial summer series, this is a series of three discussions we're having that's basically based around educational leadership topics for educators and for leaders. The first one that we had about 3 weeks ago now was on well-being, and this second one is on the much needed topic of diversity, equity and inclusion. A couple of little logistical points before we jump into the discussion, because the hour does go fairly quickly. First of all, we do have a third webinar coming up on August 2nd on messy leadership. So you can sign up for that one as well at the same URL that you were sent for this one. And for those who don't know, I'm Sean Slade. I'm one of the two co-heads of education for BTS Spark in North America, based over in the Washington, DC area. And my other co-head, Alyssa Gallagher, is based over in the LA West Coast region. As you can see, we're doing this on the Zoom platform. And whilst we're all very up to date with Zoom, we're trying to make it as useful as we can. So a couple of things to note. The slides are guiding the conversation. So we want you to understand where the conversation flow is going and what's happening. However, you do have these boxes of videos over on the right-hand side that you are able to make smaller or larger as you wish. So the boxes that you see on the right-hand side are under your control. If you want to make them larger, then you make them larger. If you want to focus on the speaker, you can focus on the speaker. We are also having questions submitted via the Q&A box. And there are also comments that you can add to the chat room. And we will be engaging you in chats and giving you some URLs of conversations or articles that we mentioned. Okay. So given that this topic is very apt and current at the moment, we're going to jump right into the introduction. What we basically do with these conversations is I'm going to lead through maybe 5 or 10 minutes maximum, hopefully not too long, of introducing the topic, introduce our esteemed panelists, and then we'll start to engage in a dialogue. As with the last conversation, we actually began this topic by posting an article to EdWeek, and our article was entitled, "Are Our Schools Any Closer to Equity?" Because it has been just over 12 months since the death of George Floyd, and it has been just over 12 months since Lafayette Plaza in Washington, DC was renamed Black Lives Matter Plaza. And it's been 12 months since we had the start of these global protests and global marches around equity and diversity. For those who follow Premier League soccer, for example, there has been a minute's silence before every soccer match and people kneeling in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter or the equity movement. Similar things have been done through sporting events in the US. But the question really becomes, are our schools any closer? We've gone through a lot of trauma. We've gone through a lot of protest, a lot of discussions, but in a way, maybe we've moved back a step rather than forward a step. Another article in EdWeek that came out about a week or so ago talks about some of the legislation that has been beginning to be put in place around the countries, trying to limit or at least control how teachers can discuss race. So far, it's in Idaho, Iowa, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and they've banned teachers from talking about certain concepts. I believe it's also been passed in Texas in the last week or so. Some of the supporters of these laws say they're designed to try and get schools to stop teaching critical race theory and other academic frameworks. The lawmakers are claiming that teachers have adopted as tenets and are teaching about race, gender, and identity in ways that might sow division among students. So we're in this time where there is this dichotomy of opinion about what we should be talking about, how we should be talking about it. But at the premise of all of this, what we're really trying to get to is how do we start to make our students and our teachers feel more included in the schools and learning, and also more included in their communities. Chalkbeat put out this map, and this was about a week or so ago, outlining the 21 states that are looking at passing legislation to try and restrict what's being spoken about in our schools regarding race and bias. So unfortunately, the conversation couldn't really come at a better time, because we are in the middle of this whirlwind of conversation about what to talk about. But I do like this article as well from ASCD in-service from Dina Simmons, when she was raising the point, which many educators have raised as well, which is that now is the time for school systems to look within themselves and to live out the equity that's in the mission statements and to make actionable plans for community and collective care. You know, equity is embedded in almost every mission statement out there for our schools. But what are we really doing in our schools with our leadership and our classrooms to ensure that happens? Unfortunately, as we also posed in that article in EdWeek a couple of weeks ago, there was a similar conversation that played out after Gavin Grimm went all the way to the Supreme Court and won on transgender rights, the whole North Carolina bathroom bill. But ever since the Supreme Court victory, we've seen a slew of legislation passed in the last 6 years that's really tried to curtail transgender students and transgender rights. And so it seems like every time we take a couple of steps forward, we have to pause, or we're being forced sometimes to take a step backwards. But then this was a bit last week where Miguel Cardona put out the statement that says that Title IX protections apply to LGBTQ plus students also. And that was a change from the previous administration. So we're seeing these compelling forces discuss these issues, reframe these issues. And so what we really want to discuss today is, what can we as school leaders, what can we as members of our community do regarding diversity, equity and inclusion in our schools and our communities? So I think we've brought together a fairly influential and distinguished group of panelists here. And I do know that we're going to be have difficulty in restraining the conversation. It probably could go on for several hours. But we do have some wise voices and wise heads to give us hopefully some wise advice as well. Dr. Chaunte Garrett serves as a K-12 superintendent in North Carolina, and her focus has always been around equitable learning. She's been a great supporter and great promoter of a whole child approach to education, strongly emphasizing high quality instruction, STEM, SEL, and college and career preparation. An active speaker and author, and really has been one of the leading voices that I've been aware of around ensuring equitable learning environments and developing sustaining professional learning communities. So welcome, Chaunte. We also have Peter DeWitt. Peter is a former teacher and a former school principal. He's also an author and a speaker, and is a leadership coach with a focus on school leadership and collaborative leadership. However, much of his work alongside this, as part of his Finding Common Ground and also his At Sit at the Table, both entities that come out of EdWeek, has been focused on the topics of race, gender, sexual orientation, and the inclusion of LGBTQ plus students in our schools. So welcome, Peter. We also have our own Victoria Rodrigue, who is our Spark partner at BTS Spark, based in San Francisco. And she's been the lead designer of our diversity, equity, and inclusion programs that we're rolling out this fall for BTS Spark. She spent her initial teaching career in Austria on a Fulbright fellowship and has been the founding member of the administrative team that opened the Basis Independent school in Silicon Valley. Principal at Miera Academy, my apologies for the mispronunciation, and a visiting committee chair for the Western Association of Schools and Colleges. So welcome, Victoria. And last but not least, we're very happy to invite in also Lacee Jacobs. Lacey Jacobs is the diversity, equity, and inclusion leader at BTS. BTS is our parent company, with BTS Spark being the not-for-profit practice that focuses on education. But Lacey's been brought on recently to really lead the charge at BTS around DEI, and she specialises in the unique approaches for both leadership, development and diversity, equity and inclusion work, with the intention to help leaders and organisations achieve alignment between what they intend to create and the impact they desire. So thank you for joining us, Lacee. All right, we're going to jump first of all into a couple of questions, and the way we do this, and I've warned the panelists about this as well, is to have a question at least focused to each of the panelists, and if others want to chime in, they're more than welcome to. And then towards the end, we'll hopefully get to a bit more of a conversation. But Chaunte, this was the article that I referenced earlier that you put out in Educational Leadership at ASCD that talks about how relevant curriculum can be equitable curriculum, but also on the flip side, if it's not relevant, it becomes inequitable. So I suppose my first question to you would be, given the fact that you're raising the issue of curriculum being something that can enhance equity, what should or could our first focus of attention be to address equity in our schools? Should it be a focus on curriculum? Should it be a focus on changing mindset? Should it be a focus on developing empathy?
Good afternoon, and thank you, Sean, and thank you for the question, and welcome everyone to this very important conversation. I hope we can hear me okay. And so that is one of the issues that a lot of school communities have. We understand equity as this very broad concept. Equity is really a value, and school communities need to understand what are your equity issues, right? And so it may not be curriculum, and a lot of times it is, but really getting to the heart of what those issues are. And so it's really challenging for school communities to identify an action step, right? Because there wasn't an event or an issue that created the inequities that we experience. It is the collection of experiences and events and mindsets that have created the inequities that exist in our schools. And so what I want teams and schools and communities to be very clear about is that multiple things can be happening at the same time in order to address inequities. Because as long as we treat this thing as it's insurmountable, it's going to be. And I don't want school communities to get trapped in the mindset and the rhetoric that there's so much going on that I'm paralyzed, at doing anything, because that's not the case. Sorry. And so, one of the things that I don't want school communities to do is to wait on mindset changes. That takes time. And we have children in our seats hurting now, right? And so that's where data and accountability comes in. So when you don't know where to begin, start with your data. Look at what your data is telling you around how Black and Brown and marginalized students are experiencing education within your environment. your data is going to tell a story, and it's going to give you a place to begin to look, be it in your discipline policies, be it in your instructional practice, and that includes the curriculum. It also includes the delivery, be it in your staffing. One of the things that is pervasive throughout study after study after study is that Black and Brown students often get the less qualified teachers. Is it in our policies? What types of policies are we enacting that are actually hurting our students more than they are helping? Is it in the content? Back to the point of it being relevant. I can have a great basal, but if I don't know how to create relevance within that content, it's not going to matter about how my children experience that. And is it in our resources? One of the things that this pandemic showed us is that we did a lot of gatekeeping around resources based on assumptions versus actual needs. And that is something that we should be addressing right now as we're preparing for a new school year. And then the other parts of this is the understanding, right? So we said the data is going to tell a story, but that experience is extremely powerful. And so one of the things that we say in our school community is that you have to know the stories before you create the stories. So oftentimes, if we're sitting in there and we're looking at our students' data, right, we can think about all of the things that have flown through our mind and all of the experience that met us in our face when we're dealing with us, when we have engaged our students, be it whatever's happening in the home, be it whatever we believe their diagnosis is. A lot of assumptions and a lot of factors, but we need to be looking at that data based on what's controlled, based on the things that we can control, but also understanding the stories as our students are living them out. That's going to be one of the most powerful pieces about creating relevancy and also understanding how to approach education, not just for all students, because that's a blanket and that's a safety for us, for each student that we serve, so that we can make sure that we're moving the needle and impacting the lives of all of them. And I want to be very clear that it's really hard for this to happen without leadership.
Yeah.
Leaders have to clear the way for the conversations and the work. And unfortunately, it's almost like a permission, where this is not something folks need permission to do. It's something that we do because it's right. But in the context of where we are right now, there has to be a movement by leadership that says, this is the expectation, and this is how we're going to make it happen. Where we're creating space for the data mining, where we're creating space for the heart clearing, and we're creating space for the change in policy and practice that's needed for our environments to be more equitable. Yeah. And so what I hope you hear me saying is overall, there has to be a commitment, a genuine commitment that we're going to do this right and get this right for our kids, period.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Peter and I have spoken previously about the influence that the principal or the school leader has in really developing that climate and culture in the school. And very often it's by doing that, it gives permission to others in the school to start to have those conversations as well. And unfortunately, if that leader does not take that step, then that non-action is actually an action. And so it actually restricts a lot of that information. Just one quick follow-up, and if anybody else wants to chime in, please do. But you mentioned accessing the data. And we have the academic data that we can access. We have the behavioral data that we can access. We have the attendance data that we can access. Is there other data that you would like to call out, or that you would want our leaders and schools to start to focus on a little bit more?
Absolutely. One is your resources and your budget, right? If we're living out equity in action, how does that play out? And that's looking at our budgets and understanding, one, how are we doing things that are impactful for the communities that are harmed the most? You know, there's a big rock, Title I funds. You have a lot of places that'll use Title I just as a blanket, right? This is how we use our Title I funds. It's safe. And, being honest, we had to re-examine how we were using our Title I funds, right? Are we getting the bang for our buck with the TAs, or do we need to add interventionists to support closing gaps? Do we need to add a social worker to support access to resources that are challenging outside of what's happening academically, right? And so it's also looking at how we are staffing, being very clear. Are we staffing based on teacher preference? Are we staffing based on student needs? Where are we putting our highly qualified and best educators? Are we putting them at the place where they're going to be of the most support and access? And also, are we staffing in a way that's going to provide the continuous growth and development? And that's where we're using our Title II funds. How are we supporting the growth of our educators in this process of developing equitable learning environments? Our policies. When you start looking at that discipline data is probably going to direct you right back to some policy that we have in place. And I want us to be very thoughtful about whether they are written or whether they are inherent.
Yeah.
Right? Because one of the things we find is that there's a law, but then within our own institutions and with our own structures, we develop the policies and practices for carrying out that law. So that law may be written with equality in mind, but when we begin to develop the steps and procedures, it actually exacerbates inequities well beyond what was expected or intended.
Yeah, excellent point. And I think the focus on the budget is one that I don't immediately think of, but but the budget, as we've said in previous talks, is the budget is a moral document. Where you put your money, is where you put your mouth, and so those are the things you care about. So have a look at the budget and see where the resources are going. Yeah, wonderful. Let's jump over to you, Peter, because you've been a leading voice, as I mentioned before, for inclusion as a principal, but also as an author and now as a school leadership coach. And I have a section of the book that you put out, and I think it was your first book, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Safeguarding LGBT students. So my question for you is, you talk about in the book about developing safe environments for all students, or as Chaunte was alluding to, each student. And again, I like that use of the word each, Chaunte. So has your advice about inclusion for LGBTQ plus students changed over all of these roles?
It's an interesting question, because I would have said, no, actually, my advice hasn't changed over the past decade. That book that you're referring to was actually based on my doctoral research. And I would say the biggest change that I had, Sean, was over 10 years ago when I was starting to do my doctoral research. I had a professor that said, hey, I think you should really focus on LGBT students, which is what the acronym was back then. And I remember saying, really? Like, I don't think that's, is it really still, is there an issue here? Because I had a very myopic view. I was in a very inclusive school district as a principal. And suddenly after that, we went through a school consolidation where we closed a one classroom per grade level school, and I absorbed the whole population. The parent created a hate blog, and I was often a topic of the hate blog because I'm openly gay. And I remember going, oh, like I didn't expect that. And I kept thinking, I'm a guy going after my doctorate. What's it like to be a 13, 14-year-old kid in this experience, right? And even back then, the university where I was doing my doctoral work actually wanted to steer me away from doing that kind of focus. So I would say that was a time where my mindset had changed, that it wasn't, I'm in a great community, and things were not as inclusive as I originally thought. over the years that I've been focusing on the LGBTQ plus population, especially in the Finding Common Ground blog, it is one of the topics where I get the most pushback. Why do you have to talk about it so much? Even if I only write about it, 3 times in a year. And I would say that overall, the inclusion practices are still the same. And a lot of what Chaunte was already talking about, I remember back then it was about making sure you had policies and codes of conduct. But what I found to be the reality is those policies and codes of conduct were not worth the paper they're written on if people weren't actually doing something about it. And we often had that happening. Like we would have school leaders say, well, we've got a policy, but they weren't doing anything about it until there actually was an issue. Like Chaunte was talking about being proactive as opposed to being reactive. And what I found in my experience over the years is that more school leaders were actually being reactive as opposed to proactive. They weren't going to do anything until somebody said anything. So that whole piece is that the inclusionary practices are still the same. What do your resources look like? I know Chaunte was talking about budget, which is fantastic. I was always looking too when I go into schools, and Sean, you and I have worked together on school climate work. I would go in and start looking at what is the literature you're using. As a former first grade teacher, I had a highly diverse school, a highly diverse classroom, and I always made sure that the books that I used, the books that I read were representative of the population that I had in my classroom, but it was also a positive representation. So looking at those resources and how people are engaging in those discussions, I think, that's something that was sort of easily done on my side, but I think people have a much more difficult time doing that. As far as what steps can school leaders take to develop a safe and supportive environment, number one is to actually acknowledge it. So often, I remember working in one state and I was talking to an assistant principal and I was talking about inclusion. And he said, oh, we're very inclusionary. And I said, okay, what about with your LGBTQ plus students? And a high school assistant principal, and he honestly said to me, we don't have any of those in our school. And I said, I don't know a lot about math, but that's statistically impossible that you don't have. So it's really about acknowledging it. And, sadly that I have to say this, it's also about normalizing it. I often find myself having conversations, sometimes within my own family, where I have people will say things like, it seems like every show has gay characters now. And it's this whole thing about the fact that representation does matter. And when we're walking through your school, what kind of representation do we see? I remember walking into a high school where they had a billboard of the acronyms LGBTQ plus and what it means. That to me was huge because it was right when you walked into the school. Other times you're walking through a school and you see stickers for gay straight alliances or safe spaces. Those are things that are really important to be able to have because they're symbols of the fact that here's a safe space that you can come to. And then, of course, we can go deeper with the resources that we're using, whether it's the books, the curriculum that we have within our classrooms. And I think also just making sure that we're having these discussions and just acknowledging that is going to help create a safe and supportive environment as well. As a principal, I wanted to know that all of my students could come to me about whatever the issues are. And I would ask principals to say, do your students actually feel that level of comfort? Do they feel like they can come to you about issues that they're having, whether it be bullying or something else? I think those are steps. How well do you know your student population? How much do you engage with the students within the hallway when you're acknowledging their names, you recognize their names and those kind of things. I think how open are you? How do you make yourself open for people to actually come to you with these kind of issues as well? So there are a whole host of other things, but I would say those are probably the top ones that I think about.
Yeah. It's funny, whenever I used to do podcasts as well as a host, the same sort of conclusions always sort of come back to strike me, which is the majority of the things that we talk about when we're talking about learning or cultural competence or personalization or diversity, equity, inclusion, it comes back to good pedagogy. It comes back to good teaching and learning. It's you want your students to feel like they matter. You want for them to feel like they belong. You want them to see themselves in the literature that they're reading. You want them to know that they can come to people and ask questions about the learning or about how safe or unsafe they feel. Like sometimes the topics we're discussing can be varied, but the majority of the things we talk about in effective schools comes down to what we know about effective pedagogy as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Let me jump on. This leads us into Victoria, and we're looking at rolling out DEI coaching and facilitation in the fall. So I wonder if you can just give us an outline of some of the things that we're looking at rolling out, and also if there are things that we've learned from other coaching work that we do that applies to this DEI work as well, Victoria.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And hi, everyone. So the focus of our programs is really on the leadership angle. And what we try to do in our coaching and in our workshops is to help leaders build relational skills and inclusive practices so that they can promote long-term and sustainable change in their schools. We don't view this as something that can be addressed through a one-off workshop, right? So it's really a process that has to be built into your school improvements. And because there's a lot of resistance and fear, we have to work on shifting the mindset to how we approach this, right? So for example, the understanding that this topic benefits everybody involved in the school. Inclusive schools, equitable practices benefit everyone. And a lot of people have had the experience of being different, of being excluded. So what we want to do in a school setting, and starting with the leader, is really focus on how do we create psychological safety so that everyone feels safe, that they can be themselves, that they can contribute, that they can speak up. And the other thing that we want school leaders to be able to do through coaching is to really be able to look at their schools through that equity lens. So you may already have a diverse student body, a diverse staff, but and coming back to resources, actually, I'm really glad that Chaunte brought this up. So it's also about where you locate students on campus. So I live in a very liberal area in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I have a friend who teaches in a district in the Bay Area. And one of the things that really bothers her is these portable classrooms and who ends up in the portable classrooms that don't have air conditioning, right? Maybe they're noisy and it's hard for the kids to concentrate. So we really want schools to be able to look at all of those things, right? Who sits on the board? Who is in leadership positions? Like who's served by your student support services? How are you meeting the needs of students, of families, of faculty? Who's showing up to your PTA meetings? Who's showing up to student meetings? How are you spending money? Who are you hiring? Who are you promoting? And really, what issues there do you see around equity and inclusion, and how can you address them? And this is something that you should be constantly doing. Because the truth is, inclusion lies at the heart of school improvement. And if you're not addressing it, you're not addressing the underlying issue, which is the school climate and the school culture. And the case for doing this work is that a positive school climate and school culture promotes all students' ability to learn, right? So this work benefits everyone. And because leaders set the tone, so we first need to understand the current climate of the school, because our goal is really to work with people and meet them where they are, and to give them those skills and those tools that are necessary to create a more inclusive environment. So this requires an honest assessment of the current leadership practice. And we've developed an inclusive leadership assessment in collaboration with BTS, our parent company, that's geared towards educators. And what we do in this assessment is we look at 7 capabilities for inclusive leaders that we've identified as being critical for our work, from our work coaching leaders. And these are collaboration, inclusive communication, cultural intelligence, courage, curiosity, empowering others, and psychological safety. So we offer this assessment at no cost, and it gives leaders a baseline just to see what are their current strengths and where can they develop. And then we address these development areas through one-to-one coaching. We can do small group coaching or a combination, what we call these inclusion journeys of workshops, coaching, and self-reflection. And then you asked about, are there things that we've learned from our coaching work? So our coaching work focuses on transforming mindsets because this lies at the heart of significant and meaningful change. And we know this takes a while and this is an ongoing process. So in coaching, we set goals using the acronym MBIR, Mindset, Behavior, Impact, Results. And we work on transforming mindsets so that we can enable behavior change necessary to have the desired impact to achieve the goal. But first, leaders need to accept this support for themselves, and that's also a mindset. So there's a phrase I heard in my first year as a principal. Somebody told me, it's lonely at the top. And I think for me, this set an expectation that I had to be the one in charge and that I couldn't need anything because I was there to give. And I think this is a common mindset because in education, we tend to attract people who are givers, people who are willing to sacrifice for others. But what this mindset does is it really blinds us to the fact that there are other people in the room, that it doesn't just come down to the decision and actions of one person, but to how we really engage everyone in the conversation. And oftentimes clients come to us and they want help being more effective and efficient in their roles because they're juggling a lot, especially in the past year. And this comes back to the mindset shift, which you can see on our mindset map there. I'm willing to let go and trust, right? It's not just about me. It doesn't have to be lonely at the top. And this, I think, is really what's at the heart of our DEI work, giving leaders the tools and the skills to create space for others, to improve relationships and engage their teams and weather change. And ultimately, this prevents burnout, right? Educators get burnt out. And what we've learned from our work is that there are a surprisingly small number of attitude changes that have a significant ability on a leader's, a significant impact on a leader's ability to adapt and to change. And these occur in 4 domains. So you can see these on our mindset map. So we talk about B, the B domain, which is about our presence, how we show up, balance, authenticity. We talk about relate, influence others, motivating, collaborating. We have inspire, which is about setting direction, championing change, challenging how things are done, and then think, deciding, innovating, organizing, and planning. And when we've analyzed past coaching conversations that we've had with principals and assistant principals, what we found is that these relate mindset shifts tend to make up about 50%, followed by B, which is 31%, and then inspire is 12%, and think mindset shifts are around 7%. So to answer your question, what we've learned from our work coaching school leaders is that a big part of being an effective leader is about how we relate to others and how we show up. And the big ideas in our DEI work, relationships, vulnerability, and empathy also correlate to these 2 domains, relate and be. So when we look at the capabilities in inclusive leadership, these skills aren't just about being an inclusive leader, they're about being an effective leader in general, because these are skills that all effective leaders need to have. And with all of our coaching, we meet people where we are. And oftentimes what happens when schools start doing this work, when they start having these difficult conversations, it can be really uncomfortable. And it may actually seem like the situation is getting worse because people are speaking up, emotions are running high. And that's really to be expected, especially if you haven't had these types of conversations before. I remember the first time I tried to run a faculty meeting where we were tackling issues of inclusion. We were struggling with issues around how students and faculty were relating to each other. And so I had everyone sit in a circle because I wanted to hear everyone's perspective and their view of the situation and what they were experiencing. And this was a new thing for the school, to be honest, because before my time, the board at that time had adopted these expectations around positive communication. And they laid them out in the faculty handbook, and it really led the faculty to feel like they couldn't bring up any issues at all because they would be seen as negative. But at this meeting, all of a sudden, people were speaking up, they were sharing, they were being open. And what happened after the meeting was really interesting because some teachers thought it was really productive and were extremely grateful to have this opportunity, and others were less comfortable with it, and they felt like the meeting had been a mistake and that we'd actually made the situation worse by talking about it. But the truth is, these problems don't go away just because we ignore them or put a positive spin on them. And I think about that meeting a lot because what we do in our DEI work is we give people the skills to manage their triggers and to have these difficult conversations skillfully. And also to understand that this is part of a process. In schools, we talk about this cycle of continuous improvement. And this is the case for DEI work as well, because it is a process. It's not a box we check off and say, okay, we're done, we're inclusive, we're diverse, we're equitable. We do want to be able to set goals. We do want to be able to measure the impact of these changes. And we really do need to hold ourselves accountable on these issues.
Exactly. It's amazing how often the terms around relate come up as well. It is I often talk about education being a human enterprise or a human profession, and the relationships that we develop are just critical. And then you also touched on areas that we actually touched on in the last webinar as well on well-being, which is you are getting these leaders and these principals who are at the top of the hierarchy, often with nobody to turn to, without a peer or colleagues or a support network. And so developing these skills is just really, really key. So Lacey, let me bring you into the conversation as well, because your work is with BTS, the parent company. And so I'm just curious if there are things that we know about effective leadership that applies directly to the DEI work.
Thank you, Sean. Hello, everyone. Yes, I think there are definitely some similarities. This is a great question. In fact, you were just talking about relate, and I see DEI as a relational sport. And it's the kind of sport that when it's done well, everyone wins. And so leaders need to be able to think and behave relationally. Often when you think about organizations where there's a challenge with equity, you can see that there's a lot of self-interest that's being prioritized. So we have to begin to think about others. Effective leaders are actually inclusive. They care about equity, and they understand the value of creating opportunities where people from diverse backgrounds, and this includes racial diversity, and diverse schools of thought are invited to the table. So there are so many similarities here. You think about the last couple of years that we've all experienced and what we've been going through in the world. Being a great and effective leader means that we have the capacity to navigate complexity. I think about the term VUCA, and VUCA, V-U-C-A, stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So when we think about the DEI landscape and effective leadership, it requires the capacity to lead in a VUCA environment. We don't have the conveniences that we used to have. Things are changing so rapidly, and we don't know what we're going to face from moment to moment. So some of what Victoria was talking about in terms of vulnerability, we need leaders that are able to be vulnerable. It's no longer possible for someone to have all the answers. And so for effective leadership, we need leaders that are willing to say, I don't know. And I think this work in the DEI space, it challenges that because people are absolutely afraid. They can be paralyzed with a sense of fear. And so being able to say, I don't know, or I'm afraid to get it wrong is imperative. And what we really want is also to be able to create these spaces where there's a sense of psychological safety, and yet we have to grow our quotient for discomfort. Because if we're not willing to be uncomfortable, we won't grow and we won't develop. And that's important when we're thinking about the capacity that people have for this work.
Yeah, no, wonderful thoughts. I'm going to bring the question that's on the list right now into the next discussion. But I'm going to open it up to everybody, because I think this sort of puts us into the current framework, which is, given our current climate and given our current circumstances, how do we approach these conversations? Because as we were discussing earlier, there are going to be people that do feel isolated in that position. They do feel vulnerable in that position. So how do we go about bringing people, both our school staff, but also our local communities, into these discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion? And Lacey, please feel free to kick us off, but I'm going to allow anybody else to chime in on this one as well.
Well, I think it needs to be an invitation, and people need to understand that when they participate in these conversations, that they're going to be heard. I think this is crucial, that no matter where people are, we've talked about this today, and meeting people where they are, it's so important. People have a difficult time speaking up if they don't feel that that's true. So there's a notion of what type of facilitation is present and how do we invite people into the conversation is very important.
And I'm going to piggyback off of Lacey and also go back to the quote from Dina Simmons about where we begin with educators, because from an educator and educational leadership perspective, if you have educators who are having a harmful experience within that environment, they are not going to create the space for students to bring their stories and their voice because they're living marginalized in their spaces. And so it is, if you're realizing there's harm within your educational environment, or if you're trying to understand harm within your educational environment, it also includes the educators that are served within that environment. You know, how are they being engaged? How are their voices being lifted? How are they being provided opportunities to lead in this work? And there are environments that need to do some work with their educators so that they are feeling like they're included and they have voice and opportunity to impact change versus being dictated to or held in a box until someone decides that I'm able to speak. And that's when there's the value of the belief that they will hold that I am capable and I am honored in this space and valued in this space, that they are going to translate over to their students, where they're going to begin to understand I'm capable, I'm valued, and I'm honored in this space. You know, there's a lot of truth. It's not just the truth around us, it's also the truth within us that has to come to the table. To Lacey's point, there has to be acknowledgement there. And then there also has to be lead for repair. And as a leader, you may need to decide, I'm not the person to lead this. I may need to be a listener in this conversation and a learner in this conversation. I'll give you an example. We opened up the year talking about safety. That was our focus for 2020, 2021, academic safety, emotional safety, physical safety, right? And out of that conversation, we were able to have some of our team members who had lived through the desegregation of schools share their experiences in the midst of that conversation that challenged their academic safety and their emotional safety. And that laid a groundwork for understanding as well as empowerment through the stories. But it also laid a groundwork to keep space for our students as they're experiencing the world doing exactly what the world has been doing for the last year and a half. And then you still have students or teachers that still said, you know, I'm uncomfortable. And I'll tell you, mine was like, you know, sometimes we got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. But then you have some teachers who came along and said, we got this. We're going to start our trauma-informed response team, and we're going to support our colleagues in hosting hard conversations with our students. And they did just that. And so the ownership just didn't fall on the person who may be wearing the hat or the title. The ownership fell on the community to help the community become better and stronger learners and create space for everyone to be included in the conversation.
You know, Sean, the other thing I would add is that I always look at making it about student learning in the instructional leadership work that I do. I look at student engagement, and we talk about what does student engagement actually mean? If you could paint a picture of student engagement, what does that mean? And some of the most powerful research that I had read over the years on student engagement comes from Odutola from 1972. And Odetola's research said that students are alienated from our schools for two reasons. One, they don't feel like they have an emotional connection to their teacher or to their school. And the other is that they don't feel like they have a voice in their own learning. And part of that conversation is about how do we engage students within our school? Now that's going to start with teachers. That's also going to expand to the community. One of the things that I also look at when it comes to student engagement, and this is probably a whole different conversation too, but is the deficit mindset piece. When we're looking at student engagement and we're talking about it, what does it look like for all of these different students that we've got, within our schools? And what I found lately, or what I found for years actually, is that there are teachers and leaders that have a deficit mindset towards kids, and it's based on skin color. Sometimes it's based on gender. Sometimes it's based on their zip code or where they come from or their last name. So when we're having these conversations, we really have to be able to acknowledge not just what the research says about student engagement and make it about student learning, because that's what we're here for, but it's also about acknowledging those implicit biases and the deficit mindset that can come along with it, I think, as well. Just as an example, last year when COVID hit and became a pandemic, I wrote a blog called 6 Reasons Why Your Students Aren't Showing Up to School, to remote learning. And Odetola's research was really at the heart of that, because it was, if we didn't have this emotional connection to our students prior to COVID, then it was a lot more difficult to get them to come to school remotely during COVID. And there were some people that posted like, are you teacher shaming, that kind of stuff. And that's not what I was doing. What I was trying to say is this is a powerful learning opportunity for us to look and say, how can we engage students in these different ways? And I feel like when you can make it about that research and focus on the student learning, then the conversation can open up in different ways. But much to what Chaunte is saying, you have to be prepared to be a part of it, right? Not just own it and control it. It's about being prepared to actually, be a part of it and learn from it. And I find the greatest conversations I have, whether it's in workshops, whether it's, a seat at the table on EdWeek, is the conversation. I always want to go in and say, what can I learn from this? And I think we need to be able to do more of it, because part of what I see also is that we're so ingrained to go in and teach all the time that we forget that we're actually supposed to be there to learn as well.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm gonna remind people, because we are coming up to the last 7 minutes, if there are questions that the audience want to ask, to type them into the Q&A box. Well, Peter, let me just follow up on that, because you were talking earlier about how you were the recipient of some hurtful community blogs and so forth, or some online words. How did you go about changing the climate or the culture of your school and your community? Was it reaching out to the community? Was it working within your staff? Was it bringing on allies? I'm just curious about what might be a starting point in some of these conversations for our listeners.
I think back then I had been a principal for about 5 or 6 years. So I'd already done that work, right? I had already greeted kids off the bus every day, gone into every classroom every morning. They called it my morning rounds. I did a lot of that stuff. So I think what happened during those moments is that it really came down to a small few who were engaged in that kind of bullying, for a lack of a better way of saying it. So it actually opened up a conversation, because some people were so mortified by what they saw that they couldn't believe that that was a part of the dialogue that was happening within their community. I always look at those kind of things, any crisis I've ever been through, I look at it as a learning opportunity. And I know that sounds, that I guess administrators say that best, right? It's like, oh, it's Monday. But I look at it and say it's a learning opportunity, because I honestly, Sean, really felt at that moment, at the time I was 40 years old, and I was looking saying, I feel this way and I'm 40 and I have a really supportive family and I am getting my doctorate. I've got, I put myself through school, all that stuff. And I just really kept thinking, what about the 11-year-old, 12-year-old, 13-year-old kids that don't have my kind of support? What do we need to do there? And that was a very powerful learning opportunity for me. And it caused us to engage in conversations. And, everybody sort of said it as a school leader, it was no longer about me. The blog was never going to say anything positive about me. What I wanted to turn the conversation into is, what does this mean for our students? What does it mean? Where do we have to engage in these conversations? Where is our entry point into these conversations? And that's what I turned it around to. But I have to also say that I could never, ever have done it without the teachers that I worked with, because I didn't have an assistant principal. It was the teachers that I worked with, and they were the ones that helped lift me up when I was feeling down, and I helped lift them up when they were feeling down. So it was definitely collaborative where that energy came from as well.
Let me raise some other questions as well, because we have a couple of minutes. And there's some other questions that have come up as we were sort of planning and discussing this topic as well, about, is it equity or teaching, or is it equity is teaching? We know there are countries around the world that have actually used equity as a school improvement driver, such as Finland, and successfully. Have we forgotten about those examples? And then you also get and this is not an uncommon statement or phrase, you get teachers and educators who say, I don't want to be bothered about the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, just let me teach the material. And so I'm curious to either one of those two questions, what the panelists' responses may be.
So I'm just going to say this very quick. When I hear these kind of things, it makes me feel like schools are going to be, they're just going to show that they're really behind, right? Because kids experience these every day. They experience them when they walk out of I made a mistake when I was a teacher a long time ago, that I was like, your personal life stops at the door and everything disappears. That was just not true. And I had to learn that was not true. It was about, how do I engage them in a different way? If we don't talk about these issues, then we're really showing our students that we're just behind the times, because they're in the faces of all of us after we leave the school. So shouldn't this be a place where we actually can engage in these conversations so we can better learn how to address them? The whole I just want to teach thing. Well, what else should we be teaching? Like, this is just a major part of what we should be teaching, right?
Right. And Peter, also, with regard to we should just teach, I think all schools, especially public schools, have accountability measures that they need to meet, right? So you're going to be looking at your test scores, you're going to be looking at your graduation rates, you're going to be looking at your suspension and expulsion rates, and you're going to have to disaggregate that data. Well, okay, you can't just then teach, because it's not going to improve your test scores, and school improvement is out the window. So that's kind of how I push back against that, because you have to look at what the underlying issues are in order really to be able to address student learning.
And you have to be thoughtful. It's not just about what you teach, it's about who you teach. Like, we are developing the next generation of change makers, thinkers, creators, and those types of things. And if you are not teaching the students in front of you, who are you developing? I had a teacher come up to me after a presentation and ask me, my kids, I'm sitting here and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And then they'll turn around and tell me that they think I'm racist. How do I stop making them call me racist? I said, why don't you ask them what's making them feel that way? Right? Because guess what? You can do all of these things, but if I am believing that you are doing something that is racist towards me, that automatically has impeded the learning opportunity that has been prepared in that room. And it doesn't mean that you are racist, but it does mean that you need to have an awareness of what's taking place and how it's impacting learning in that classroom. So these issues just can't come off the table. When we're confronted with these issues, we have to be the adults and support our kids in thinking through, processing, healing through, and becoming change makers for these issues that they are experiencing.
I just want to add one quick thing. For those of us that are confronted with people who are saying these things and have this type of belief, I think this is where we have to, in our own leadership, to dig deep and get curious, to have the hard conversations, to see if there's an opportunity to shift the mindset here, because it does get in the way.
Yeah, wonderful. And again, when you were talking as well, Lacey, and also Chaunte, I was reminded of work that I used to do in the youth development resilience field. No matter what you do, if a student doesn't feel cared for, doesn't feel like they belong, doesn't feel like they're heard, then whatever your actions that have caused that need to be changed. It's not your intent, it's how they feel it and how they believe it. So going back and asking the students, why do you feel this way, is such a key piece of advice. And the other thing that jumped out as well, I'm not sure to other people, but to me today as well, was we're lifelong learners. And just because you're in a position of school leader, principal, superintendent, author, speaker, anything else, doesn't mean that you stop learning. As our schools change and our communities change and our focus changes, we need to be learning and adjusting consistently, especially, as you were saying, Lacey, as well, in this VUCA world that we're entering. Thank you very much to our panelists. As always, we could have gone on for another half an hour or more. For those who asked, this is being recorded, and everybody that registered will get an email link when it goes up on our YouTube page. You can also sign up from today onwards for our discussion, which also links back to this on messy leadership. Actually, it's based around how do we start to effectively develop leaders who can thrive, not only survive, but also thrive in this VUCA world that we have been in, but also this VUCA world that we're entering, because the complexity and the ambiguity is going to continue. So thank you, everybody, for that. I apologize for going, I think it was 2 minutes overboard, but I'm sure you'll forgive us. Thank you.